Great, very provocative. Love the Lunchables. I can honestly say I don't think I've ever actually eaten a Lunchables, but I'm intrigued. Maybe
You've missed something.
I've missed out something important in life here, so I'll give it a try. This is great discussion, and I want to thank all the speakers this morning for bringing all this together. We really, I think, kind of put a framework together around the patient journey, how important it is that we start dealing with this problem, the ability to afford medicines in today's environment. Ken made the comment of 1990 to 2021. I guess I'd submit the reimbursement model, drug development model, every element of our healthcare model in 1990 that we're still trying to apply here in 2021 ought to be maybe one of the areas we're thinking about in terms of incentivizing drug development. So let me start teeing up a few questions here. And in the context of that perspective of we just can't afford medicines to come through that are going to cost so much for these chronic diseases that are highly prevalent. So you're going to have a lot of people. What are some of the big levers that we've talked about, individualized medicine, AI, that you think would be the most impactful in the short term? And then this is the corollary to that. And then what new problems do we create by moving in that direction? So let me start first, maybe with CHRONIS and get your thoughts on it. And then I'll ask Kristen to comment as well.
So this notion of, more indication-based reimbursement or more niche reimbursement or niche development, I think is an interesting one. I always go back to being as part of an integrated delivery system with, 7,000 employed docs at UPMC. There's always the desire to have access to every product. The tension is formulary and kind of our traditional tools. But as we move to a lot of risk arrangements, people are going to want access to the right therapy at the right time for the right patient. And how do you start to break down some of the traditional barriers and allow that kind of flexibility? And then I think where Ken was going is how do you almost back that up into the trial development process and start to streamline with pragmatic trials and things like that. But I think we're going to be forced into abandon more traditional barriers and say, because the therapy that's coming out is so precision based that it doesn't typically just fit these large buckets of indications. And how do we, as an industry, there's no incentive for a Lilly to come out with a drug that we're going to block out. But if that drug really performs well in a population, how do we enable that access to that indication and give you the incentive to put the R&D efforts to it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Kirsten, what are your thoughts around these challenges and how would we tell the academic community, biotech and pharmaceutical industry to that it's okay to start putting investments in these models or in these drugs?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll go back to some of the analogies that I used, and I appreciated Ken's point that it is time to break the old model. So I'll talk a bit about things that have worked historically, and then what I think we need to develop going forward. I mean, again, going back to oncology, it's been priority review and orphan drug. I mean, and that's not just oncology; that's rare disease as well. That drug manufacturers have an expectation of faster review and market incentives for certain diseases, typically small population. Now, you asked what's the second order consequence of that? We now have a number of drugs that are high cost for targeted at relatively small groups of patients, and we have health systems who can't afford them. So we have that tension between the formulary and the product. Again, I'll go back and contrast that to what we saw with the COVID-19 vaccine development. The unit cost of the vaccines has been relatively low, but the companies had an expectation that there would be broad uptake. So I would go back to what would be the things that would facilitate broad uptake and open access in formularies, so that drug manufacturers would be more willing to invest in something knowing they had a market size. I go back to the development of real-world evidence. We still don't have standardized ways that we use and share real-world evidence. We don't have, with the exception of some very serious cancers, there's been limited use of real-world evidence in clinical trials. If we could get these drugs faster to market, monitor them in the patients who are using them, and have validated endpoints of this drug is working, this drug isn't working, so that you can do more value-based designs where you could have a patient get a low copay or no copay if the drug is particularly working for them, and know quite quickly what populations the drugs are not working in. And then the final point I'll raise is we have done very little to come up with validated measures for particularly vulnerable patients. We know that things like intergenerational trauma, stress, crowded housing, hard working situations affect chronic disease. But we don't have, that's not part of our most standard screenings. We don't really necessarily prioritize people. Again, just look at how the COVID vaccine has been rolled out. It's been largely based on age, yet we know that there are these other risk factors that affect our mortality. What can we learn from this to start developing endpoints that really reflect who's likely to suffer and die so that we can target the new medicines at those people and reduce the waste and get them to people who are most benefited by them?
Yeah, maybe I'll pull on a string there, because I think Ken also brought up kind of the social aspect of taking care of public health. And there's certainly a big underlying social driver around some of the events that lead to poor health and poor outcomes. How does this group, and also from patient perspective, KIRSTEN, I'd love to hear, how did this group think about the interdependencies between developing new therapeutics versus making sure we run a healthy society, and how do those work together, and what would be some of the challenges that we could maybe break through to improve that interdependencies? We'll get to the crowd in a moment, folks that are putting questions online. I note Dr. Califf has added a few, so when we get to that point, I'm sure he'll have some comment, because I think he feels strongly as well around the interdependencies of social behaviors and therapeutic interventions. But I'll ask this group first. What are your thoughts? Ken, can I start with you? And then I want to hear, KIRSTEN, from you from a patient perspective, what you think about that question.
I think they're absolutely interrelated. KIRSTEN just brings up a really good point. When you look at chronic disease, there are several pathways that are implicated in nearly all chronic disease, independent of the genome that we're all born with. One of them is early development. If at age 3, I learned that every time I felt some pain, I fell down, I did whatever else, that a sucker was coming, sugar just became a thing that is a drug that I will be on for the rest of my life. Unlearning that is a really, really hard job to do. We don't have an unlearning button in our brain. But there's other things too, the inflammatory circuits that are there. When I've got somebody that's worried about how do I pay my bills, I'm working at a McDonald's or a Carl's Jr. and I'm trying to take an order, and I'm in the back of my head thinking, I'm a single parent and I don't know if my children are going to have their own food to eat tonight. That is such a stress load that the ability to actually think through what are the behavioral choices I'm doing next and all those types of things is nearly overwhelming for all of us. And any of us would break in that circumstance. So this idea that these things are separate and distinct, and therapy is one thing, and then social issues are totally separate and distinct from that, I think that's a flawed way of actually thinking through the process. We need to be thinking about these as intertwined together. When I develop a therapy, how does that therapy interact with the same circuits that are going to be activated throughout my every part of my life? I can't just give you an injection every time your sugar level goes up, if we're going to stick with diabetes for a second, and make that go back down if I'm ignoring everything else that's happening inside. So I guess for me, they're absolutely interconnected. We can't pull them apart, but the development process to date has not really acknowledged that. We have a process that is set up to actually say, who are the most, if I can use it in quotes, clean patients out there? I want the patients who have no other problems going on in my trial, so I can establish causality in this mechanism of action that's in front of me. That's a flawed process. I mean, I won't name the drug, and I'll leave it alone. It was a brain drug that was brought. It was approved, and the thing was they presented the data that was around it, and it was good data, and it was hundreds of patients. And then they pointed out that, as we asked more questions, all the patients in that trial had no other drugs that they were taking at the time. It's like, you realize that this disease is a post-65 disease, and every patient at that point has got, all these other drugs in them. You probably used all 400 patients in the entire country that are clean patients in your trial, and we don't even know how this thing works with all these other people. So those types of things. Our development process does not sync up to the reality of how we actually live.
No, I would agree with that. And, just from from the perspective that we're developing drugs for, signs and symptoms of clusters of diseases that we don't understand, I think there really needs to be a shift towards looking at underlying mechanisms and systems-based biology, right? Because we have a growing population in the United States who doesn't have this acute one simple condition model, right? We've become a nation that has interconnected multiple chronic conditions, but our science isn't following that, and our R&D isn't following that as well. And I wish I had answers to this problem, but I think it starts with a societal importance. There was a speaker on the last panel that talked about, why has there been priority put towards cancer and in some cases infectious disease. And this has been a long time theme in chronic pain and other chronic diseases, that we prioritize things that, one, kill us, or two, are communicable. And he said, and all of these other conditions we're just kind of walking around with dealing with. But I hope that just from the, few slides that I showed today in terms of the patient experience, you can understand how impactful those other things that we're dealing with and trying to walk around and function with are. And that is the nation that we've become. And none of our systems are aligned with that. We're aligned with acute care systems. So it has to come from a societal level of placing importance on well-being, on wellness, on prevention, on living well with illnesses, not just, okay, let's attack those that either kill us or are communicable, and the rest of the things are just really not a priority.
I'm going to tee up a question here that actually came from the audience. Dr. Robert Califf sent this in. He was asking us if we increase incentives for common chronic diseases, will that hurt rare diseases, cancer, and immunological therapies? And I know we've talked a lot last week as well as this week about really starting to try to understand the underlying biology of the disease, the biological basis of the disease, so we can understand what really lies within this huge population of depression or diabetes, and start getting individualized therapies, which may lead us down the path like cancer, right? Because in 1990, cancers were very different than the way we think about them today. So I'd like to hear from the group, what are your thoughts of, if we start to segment down in these highly prevalent chronic diseases into smaller populations, and we follow the cancer model, will that incentivize people to do research here? Or will that disincentivize people from focusing on those other diseases like the cancers and the rare diseases? Or what do you think that the environmental impact will be if we were to shift chronic diseases into these subpopulations? Okay, I guess I should ask to start with CHRONIS. Why don't I start with you, and then we'll work through the crowd here.
Well, my sense is you can have your cake and eat it too. I mean, I think you go back, I often say this, and, I'll show my age here, but, back in 2003, we should ask the audience if they knew what the top 5 drug categories are when I was struggling, with 12 and 13 and 50% drug trends, right? They were statins, they were ACE ARBs, they were SSRIs. They were non-sedating antihistamines. We give all that stuff away, right? So obviously, you know, we didn't have much specialty drug R&D at the time. We had very little. At some point, you know, the managed care environment became a problem, and science just got a lot better, and it shifted. But I don't know why there's not room for both. You know, why do we have the type of diabetes drugs we have today for type 2? Some, you know, there's still room for large population innovation, and you know, we still have to solve things like adherence. You know, we have to separate what's convenience related versus true adherence, true barriers. You know, I still today, my own family members won't take statins because of a stigma. I really don't know it's a side effect. It's just a stigma. So, you know, I think we can have our cake and eat it too. And I think if COVID showed us in the face of an emergency, innovation happens, and I hope we're not in a zero-sum game where we have to have one or the other, because you look at the transformative therapies that are coming in the next few years with gene therapy and CAR T and everything else. We have to figure out a way to enable that, but we shouldn't, you know, chronic disease shouldn't be the sacrificial lamb in that.
Yeah, I think that's probably some of my thinking too. The challenge is, and I think several people have brought this up, is there has to be a value-based approach to it, right? We just can't keep increasing the cost of reimbursement for drugs, right? There's got to be an overall health economic driver, I guess. So we're not just driving up healthcare cost by bringing forward these gene therapies, which are going to be terribly expensive. Right. So why don't I ask Kirsten, and then Ken, I'll ask you as well to kind of follow up on that question.
Thank you. No, I don't think it's a zero-sum game, and I don't think it's a balloon where you step on one side and it bulges out the other. There are some constraints, right? If the probability of achieving a bigger market size and a more lucrative financial outcome grows in one market relative to another market, investment is likely to flow into that market. But investment is not a totally constrained resource, right? I mean, you look at even just over the last several years, R&D has grown much faster than the market for biopharmaceuticals. So it's not like they just keep pace, and that's on the private sector side. You know, on the public sector side, the investment in basic research, such as NIH funding, is a bit more constrained by government budgets. So, you know, shifting around prioritization could potentially take away from one to fuel another. But again, I guess the question would be, do we have the right balance right now?
I'll add the following to that. It's I think maybe the way that we can think about it is where do the dollars come from? It's not like the dollars on health are fixed. Investment dollars are going into technology, into retail, into self-driving cars. They're going into all sorts of different places. And as long as there's a good return that's there, nobody's going to pull back from late-stage cancer drugs. You know, the reality is when you have stage 4 cancer and death is a reality, that's a lot of pain to deal with, both physical and emotional pain that comes with that. And that drives us to want a solution. I think, though, if we can extend our time horizon out and how we think about this problem, Carl, the way to think through this might be more on the lines of not it's a switch that gets switched in 2021, but rather that if we look at it's 20 years to Chronis's point, you know, in 20 years from now, what are the problems that we think that we're going to be dealing with, and how do we start intercepting those things? So for rheumatoid arthritis, we're not going to make people who are in late stage disease go away. They still need solutions for where they're at. But there are lots of people who are in an early stage of disease right now where there's opportunity to arrest that disease. And you know, on one of the points that Kirsten brought up earlier, as it relates to some of the social issues that are out there, when we're activating inflammatory circuits on a regular basis, or if, you know, some of the science proves out that, you know, things like certain types of things that we eat become pro-inflammatory type pathways that get developed, pro-inflammatory pathways are going to bring us more cancers and more rheumatoid arthritis, more Crohn's disease. If we find ways of actually lightening that circuit and go in the other direction, it would appear that you could actually say, hey, maybe we can have less rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease and less psoriatic arthritis or psoriasis that's there, and actually pull that back the other way. And as that takes place, we'll see a shift take place, and it might take 5 years or 10 years, and people will start shifting into earlier stage disease.
Good comments. When I think about the flow of the discussion last week and how we incentivize the R&D and start getting new biological targets, and then today as we started thinking about what are the kind of economic incentives and why should we do this and why is it important from the patient perspective, I'm pretty encouraged about the way we're framing this up, because this afternoon we're going to have a session that really looks at kind of what the clinical and regulatory hurdles to get at some of these problems. So we talked about identifying the targets. We talked about how do we increase the incentives for funding those targets, and then as we start thinking about clinical trial designs, because the R&D part of it is one of the barriers. You can only develop so many drugs if you've got to spend $1 billion developing a single molecule for a single indication. So this afternoon, we'll start talking about kind of what are those clinical and regulatory challenges to be able to start decreasing time and cost, which hopefully then culminates in the back end with lower pricing, more affordability, and more access. So then we bring the whole ecosystem together. So we're at about our time for this morning. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us and bringing all your insights into this discussion. And with that, I think we will dismiss, unless I don't think I see any additional questions from folks online. So I think with that, I will dismiss us for the morning session. We're going to take about a half a minute lunch break, or half an hour lunch break, and we come back at 1 o'clock.